The town had always been a quiet place, where everyone knew each other's names and where mornings started with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. The streets were lined with small shops, each with its own story and family behind it. It wasn't fancy, but it had warmth, the kind of warmth that made people stop and chat in the middle of the road, even if they were running late. Life used to move slowly there, and people liked it that way. But over time, things began to change. It started with whispers, the kind people usually ignore at first. Some said the new officials were taking more than their fair share. Others believed the local leaders were favoring a few business owners, while the rest struggled to survive. Prices went up, rules became unfair, and soon neighbors began looking at each other differently. Suspicion replaced trust, and laughter on the streets became rare. At the corner of the market, near an old lamppost that flickered at night, was a small repair shop. The man who owned it was known for being quiet and hard-working. He had been fixing things for years: radios, bicycles, clocks, and sometimes even people's broken spirits. He never involved himself in town matters, but he noticed everything. He noticed the way people avoided eye contact, how the shopkeepers stopped sharing tea breaks, and how arguments started over the smallest things. Every morning, he would open his shop early and watch as the town came alive. The market would fill with voices, vendors calling out their prices, children running around, and the smell of fried snacks drifting through the air. But lately, those same mornings had turned tense. People argued about who owed what, who was cheating whom, and who wasn't paying fair taxes. Even the laughter of children had started to fade away. He didn't say much, but he could feel the weight in the air. He saw how something invisible had crept into people's hearts: anger, fear, and frustration. He knew it wasn't just about money or business. It was about respect, fairness, and being heard. Everyone felt cheated in some way, and that made them bitter. One morning, as he swept the front of his shop, he overheard two men shouting near the vegetable stall. Their words were sharp, full of years of pent-up anger. A small crowd gathered, watching as insults turned into threats. No one tried to stop it. The man sighed quietly, put down his broom, and stepped inside his shop. He turned on the small radio sitting on the shelf, hoping to drown out the noise with music, but even the cheerful tune couldn't hide the tension outside. By midday, the argument had spread. A group of vendors took sides, and before long, the entire market was caught in a heated exchange. Customers hurried away. Shop shutters began closing one by one. The man stood at his doorway, watching the chaos grow. He didn't move, didn't speak, just observed. He knew deep down this wasn't about vegetables or space or rules. It was about something much deeper. The community that once stood together was falling apart piece by piece. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the hill and the last of the crowd disappeared, the market looked different. Trash was scattered everywhere, and the air still carried the echo of angry voices. The man locked his shop and sat on the wooden bench outside. He looked at the sky, the first stars appearing above, and felt a sadness he couldn't explain. It wasn't his fight, yet it felt like his home was breaking right in front of him. Days passed and things didn't get better. People started keeping to themselves. Old friends stopped visiting. The police made a few rounds, but their presence only added more tension. Rumors grew like wild plants. Stories about stolen goods, unfair fines, and secret deals. Trust had vanished completely. One afternoon, while fixing a broken wall clock, the man heard someone shouting his name from outside. It was an old shopkeeper, his hands shaking with anger. He complained that his stall had been moved by force, that the market leader had taken his spot for someone else. The man listened patiently, wiping the oil from his hands. The old shopkeeper didn't need a solution. He just needed someone to hear him. So the man listened. When the shopkeeper left, he realized how hungry people were for understanding, not arguments. That night, he stayed awake longer than usual. The ticking clocks in his shop seemed louder than ever. He kept thinking about how everything had spiraled so fast. Maybe everyone had been waiting for someone to take the first step toward peace, but no one wanted to be the one to do it. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. The streets were still empty, the air cool and quiet. He walked through the market, past the closed stalls and faded posters. He noticed the broken signboard at the entrance and the trash scattered across the street. It looked like a place that had lost its soul. He picked up a broom lying near a crate and began sweeping the road. No one asked him to do it. He just felt it needed to be done. As he cleaned, one of the vendors passing by stopped to watch. Then another joined. Within an hour, a few people started helping him clear the trash. No one spoke, but something silent passed between them, a feeling that maybe things could still be fixed. By noon, the market looked a little better. The stalls reopened and the smell of food returned. People were cautious but polite. The man went back to his shop feeling a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't said a single word, but his small act had started something. Later that day, a young boy ran into his shop with a broken toy truck. The man smiled and began fixing it. As he worked, he noticed the boy's mother waiting outside, talking kindly to another vendor. It was the first friendly conversation he had heard in days. When he handed the toy back, the boy grinned from ear to ear. That smile reminded him of what had been missing all along: hope. That night, as he locked up, he looked at the market again. The lights were dim, but for the first time in weeks it felt calm. The air was lighter, almost peaceful. He didn't think of himself as a hero or a leader. He was just someone who wanted to see his town return to the way it was: simple, fair, and kind. He knew things wouldn't change overnight. There were still angry people, still problems to solve, and still distrust in the air. But he also knew that one small action could grow into something bigger. Maybe, just maybe, if everyone did one good thing instead of complaining, the town could find its way back. As he closed the door and turned off the light, the sound of the ticking clock filled the room again. To him, it sounded like a heartbeat, steady, alive, and patient. The man smiled faintly, believing that just like time, order would find its way back too. It was only a matter of when. The next morning started quietly, the kind of quiet that felt uneasy. The market was open, but the sounds were softer than usual. People were working, but their eyes moved around carefully as if they were expecting another argument to start at any moment. The man opened his little repair shop and began arranging his tools, pretending not to notice the tension. But deep inside, he could feel it. Something was about to happen. The air was thick with unspoken anger. Every little thing seemed to annoy people now. If a customer paid with a large note, the vendor frowned. If someone accidentally stepped on another's mat, sharp words followed. The peace that had existed for years felt like a fragile thread ready to snap. By noon, the sun burned down on the tin roofs and tempers grew even hotter. The man had just finished repairing a wristwatch when he heard loud shouting again. He looked up and saw two men standing near the fruit stalls, pointing fingers at each other. One accused the other of stealing customers. The other yelled back that he was being cheated. Within minutes, a crowd formed. People pushed forward, eager to see what would happen. The man sighed and stepped out of his shop. He stood a few feet away, watching as the argument grew louder. Someone threw a small crate and fruits rolled across the ground. The crowd began to shout, and suddenly it was chaos all over again. He could see the fear in some faces, anger in others, and complete helplessness in a few. He knew that if no one did something now, things would spiral out of control. He walked closer, slowly but with purpose. His steps were calm, steady. No one noticed him at first. Then, as he came between the two angry men, people began to quiet down a little. He didn't raise his voice or wave his hands. He just stood there looking at both of them. The silence that followed felt strange after all the shouting. He spoke in a calm tone. He didn't take sides or blame anyone. Instead, he asked a simple question. Why were they fighting? The two men were still breathing hard, anger written all over their faces. One said he had been cheated. The other said he was being harassed. Both had their own stories, their own pain. The man listened quietly, letting them speak one after another. As they talked, their voices began to soften. The crowd started listening too. The man didn't interrupt. He didn't preach. He just reminded them that they had both been friends once, that they had stood together through tough times, and that one argument shouldn't destroy years of respect. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then one of the men looked down, realizing how foolish the whole thing had become. The other followed, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Slowly, the tension began to melt. The man smiled slightly and stepped aside, letting them shake hands. The crowd, which had gathered expecting drama, now watched something else: peace. A few clapped softly, others nodded, and before long, people went back to their work. The man turned and walked back to his shop. Without saying much, he picked up his tools again as if nothing had happened. But deep down, something inside him felt lighter. Later that day, a few vendors came by to thank him. They said he had done what no one else could, calm everyone down. He brushed it off, saying anyone could have done it. But they knew better. It wasn't about loud words or authority. It was about presence, patience, and understanding. The word spread faster than he expected. By evening, people were talking about how the quiet repairman had stopped a fight that could have turned ugly. Some even called him brave, though he didn't see himself that way. He had only done what felt right. That night, as he closed his shop, he saw the two men who had been fighting earlier sitting together, sharing tea. They were laughing again as if nothing had ever happened. It brought a small smile to his face. Maybe this was what the town needed, small reminders that peace was still possible. But not everyone saw it that way. There were a few people in the town who didn't like what he had done. They had been using the chaos to their advantage, taking bigger shares, spreading rumors, and keeping people divided. To them, peace meant losing control, so when they heard about the man, they began to whisper. They said he was interfering, that he was trying to look like a hero. The next morning, he noticed a few strange looks. Some people ignored him, others whispered when he passed by. It didn't bother him much, but he could feel the change. Still, he kept to his work. He fixed broken fans, clocks, and old radios, greeting everyone the same way, with quiet respect. One afternoon, an old woman came to his shop carrying a torn piece of cloth. It wasn't something he usually fixed, but she explained that it was a flag her late husband used to hang outside their house. The cloth had faded and ripped during the recent fights. She said she wanted it repaired because it reminded her of a time when the town was united. The man took it carefully and promised to mend it. As he worked on the flag that evening, he thought about what the woman had said. Maybe that's what people needed, a reminder of what they once stood for. Not power, not control, but togetherness. The following day, he returned the flag to the woman. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and thanked him. When she hung it outside her stall, people stopped to look. It wasn't just a piece of cloth anymore. It had become a sign, a quiet message that things could still be better. But just as hope was returning, trouble appeared again. Late in the afternoon, a group of angry vendors stormed into the market, complaining about new rules made by the local authorities. They said their stalls were being moved unfairly. The argument spread fast, and soon the entire market was shouting once again. The man stepped out of his shop, his heart heavy. He didn't want to interfere again, but when he saw the fear on people's faces, the same fear from before, he couldn't stay silent. He walked into the center of the crowd. The noise was deafening. He raised his hand asking for silence, but no one heard him. Then, without a word, he climbed onto an old wooden crate and simply stood there. At first, no one noticed. But then someone pointed. "He's there again!" The shouting slowed. People turned to look. The man didn't shout or wave. He just waited. Slowly, voices began to fade. The crowd quieted down enough for him to speak. He reminded them that they were destroying their own market, their own homes. He said anger wouldn't solve anything. It would only make their children afraid to grow up there. His words weren't perfect, but they were honest. He spoke like one of them, not above them. By the time he finished, the crowd was silent. A few people nodded. Others looked ashamed. Someone muttered that maybe he was right. Slowly, the argument dissolved. People went back to their stalls, tired but calmer. When the man stepped down from the crate, an old vendor patted his shoulder and said quietly, "You saved us again." The man shook his head and replied softly, "No, I just reminded everyone what we already knew." That night, he walked home under the dim streetlights. The road was quiet, but his mind was full. He didn't know how long he could keep doing this, but he felt something growing. Not power, but purpose. Maybe restoring peace wasn't about grand actions. Maybe it was about small choices made every day, by ordinary people who refused to give up on what was right. As he reached his home and looked back toward the market, he saw the repaired flag waving gently in the wind. It made him smile. For the first time in a long while, he believed that peace was not just a memory. It was slowly finding its way back. Days passed after the second fight, and for a short while the market seemed to breathe again. People started greeting each other more often. The old woman's repaired flag still hung proudly near the entrance, fluttering gently whenever the wind blew. It had become more than just cloth. It was a reminder of what the town once stood for. The man continued with his daily routine, fixing things quietly and helping anyone who came his way. But even though the surface looked peaceful, he could feel that not everyone was happy about the calm returning. Behind the scenes, a few people were upset with the way things were changing. They had grown comfortable using fear and confusion to get what they wanted. The man's quiet influence was beginning to undo that. Some started spreading small rumors about him, saying he was trying to become the new leader or that he was pretending to care to gain attention. He heard whispers when he walked by, but he never reacted. He knew words could be as dangerous as actions if he gave them power. One afternoon, while repairing an old fan, he noticed two men watching him from across the street. They weren't customers. They just stood there whispering to each other. After a few minutes, they walked away. The man didn't think much of it at first, but later that evening, someone came to his shop and told him that certain people didn't like his involvement in the recent incidents. The messenger wasn't threatening him, just warning him to be careful. That night, he sat by his small window looking out at the quiet street. The thought of being disliked for doing something good confused him. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just someone who wanted peace. But he understood now that peace sometimes made enemies too. Those who thrived in chaos would always resist it. The next morning, he opened his shop as usual. The day went by slower than most. Fewer people came by, and the cheerful chatter he had grown used to was missing. Still, he kept his calm smile and continued working. He believed that if he remained steady, others would eventually follow his lead. By afternoon, a loud noise broke the silence. Someone had overturned a cart near the middle of the market. People rushed toward the scene, curious and anxious. When the man reached there, he saw one of the fruit vendors sitting on the ground holding his arm. His cart was destroyed and his goods were scattered everywhere. A small group of men stood nearby, pretending to help but clearly smirking behind their words. It was clear that this wasn't an accident. The man knelt down, helped the vendor to his feet, and asked him what had happened. The vendor hesitated, afraid to speak. The man didn't push him. He just looked around at the crowd and said calmly that whoever caused it should take responsibility. The group of men who had been watching him began to mutter. One of them stepped forward and accused the vendor of blocking the road, saying he deserved it. Their tone was sharp, meant to provoke. The man didn't respond to the insult. He simply helped the vendor gather his scattered fruits. When one of the men tried to push him aside, he looked up quietly and said, "This market belongs to everyone. If we destroy each other's place, we all lose." His words weren't loud, but they carried enough strength to make a few people step back. The men left after a few more harsh words, clearly not expecting him to stay calm. The man helped rebuild the fallen cart piece by piece. Others soon joined, bringing tools, ropes, and wooden planks. Within an hour, the cart was standing again, and the vendor smiled for the first time in days. It was a small victory, but one that brought back a bit of hope to everyone watching. But not everyone was happy with that outcome. That evening, when the market was closing, the man found a piece of paper slipped under his door. It said, "Stay out of what isn't yours." There was no name, no signature, just a message. He looked at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it inside a drawer. He wasn't scared, but he knew things were changing fast. Over the next few days, he noticed that some people avoided talking to him openly. Others, however, started visiting him quietly, asking for advice or simply wanting to share their worries. One young vendor told him that the new market officers were demanding extra payments that weren't written in any rule book. Another said that he was being threatened for speaking up. The man listened to all of them patiently, noting every detail. He didn't have power, but he had trust made, and that was worth something. He began helping in small ways again. He guided people on how to file complaints properly, how to stand together without creating fights. He even spoke to a few honest officers in private, convincing them to pay more attention to the unfair rules being enforced. Slowly, tiny changes began to appear, but with every improvement, the opposition grew stronger. The people who had been controlling things behind the curtain were starting to feel the ground shift beneath them. One late evening, when most stalls had closed, two men approached his shop. They spoke politely, but their message was clear. "Stop interfering." They told him the market had survived long before him and didn't need his help. The man listened silently. When they were done, he nodded and said, "Maybe, but surviving isn't the same as living peacefully." The men didn't like that answer, but they didn't argue further. They left, warning him to think carefully about what he was doing. That night, the man didn't sleep much. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was worried for the people who had started to believe again. If something happened to him, would the peace disappear too? He didn't want the town's hope to depend on one person. It needed to belong to everyone. The next morning, he decided to take a different approach. Instead of reacting to every argument or unfair act, he began organizing quiet talks between vendors. He asked them to share their problems openly with each other, instead of letting anger build up. At first, only a few showed up, but within a week, more people began attending. They discussed ways to make the market fair again, how to share space, how to manage disputes, and how to help one another when problems arose. Soon, something beautiful started to happen. People began standing up for one another. When someone tried to cheat or intimidate a vendor, others spoke up instead of staying silent. The man didn't have to be in the center anymore. The market had started finding its own strength again. But as the peace grew, so did the tension with those who didn't want it. One evening, a small fire broke out near a storage shed behind the stalls. Panic spread fast and people shouted for help. The man ran to the scene along with a few others. They managed to put out the fire before it spread, but everyone knew it wasn't an accident. The timing was too perfect and the message too clear. Someone wanted to remind the town that peace was fragile. As the crowd stood there, breathing heavily from exhaustion, the man spoke softly. "They want us afraid again. Don't give them that. Fear is what breaks us." The people nodded, and instead of scattering in panic, they stayed together, helping each other clean up the mess. That night, for the first time, the man saw something in their eyes: determination. From then on, the market wasn't just a place to buy and sell. It became a place where people looked out for one another. Small acts of kindness became common again. A vendor sharing food with another, children laughing as they played around the stalls, an old man fixing benches for free. Life began to feel normal, maybe even better than before. The man continued to work quietly, never asking for attention. He still fixed clocks and fans, still smiled at everyone who passed by. But now when people saw him, they saw more than just a repairman. They saw hope, the kind that grows not from power but from courage and patience. And though he knew more challenges were waiting ahead, he also knew something had changed forever. The people were no longer afraid to stand for what was right. And that, to him, was the first real sign that order, true order, was finding its way back. The evening air was heavy that day. Clouds gathered above the town, covering the sky in shades of gray. The man could feel something uneasy in the air as he closed his repair shop. He had seen enough signs to know that peace never came without being tested. The market had grown stronger, but there were still a few who didn't like what it had become: fair, united, and hopeful. They had lost control and they weren't ready to accept that. As darkness settled, a loud noise echoed from the far end of the market. It was shouting, angry, desperate shouting. The man turned quickly, his heart racing. He could see flashes of movement near the center square where the stalls met. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his small lantern and hurried toward the noise. When he reached there, chaos had already taken over. Dozens of people were gathered, yelling and pushing. A few stalls were knocked over, and smoke was rising from a small fire burning near a pile of wooden crates. The man could see fear spreading again, the same fear that had once broken the town apart. Someone shouted that the officers were coming, and panic grew worse. He looked around and saw the faces, the same vendors, the same families, but they were no longer calm. Anger had returned, stronger than before. It didn't matter who started it. What mattered was that the fire of chaos was back. The man's chest tightened. He knew if this moment got out of hand, everything they had built would be lost. He stepped forward, but no one noticed him at first. People were too busy shouting and blaming one another. The flames behind them grew taller, casting wild shadows on their faces. The man picked up a bucket, filled it from the nearby pump, and threw the water over the burning crates. The hiss of the fire caught a few people's attention. He grabbed another bucket and threw more water. This time someone joined him. Then another. Within minutes the fire was out, but the noise hadn't stopped. He climbed onto a wooden platform near the fountain and raised his voice for the first time. "Enough!" The sound of that single word carried across the square. It wasn't a shout of anger. It was deep, steady, and filled with something stronger than fear. People turned to look at him. The market lights flickered. The wind blew dust around, and for a moment everything was still. He looked at the faces around him, faces twisted in worry, anger, and pain. "Is this what we have become again?" he asked quietly. "Did we forget everything already?" No one answered. Some lowered their heads, others looked away. He spoke again, slower this time. "We said we wanted peace. We said we were tired of fighting. But peace doesn't come from waiting. It comes from standing for it even when it's hardest." Someone in the crowd shouted that the rules weren't fair, that no one listened to them. The man nodded. "I know," he said, "but breaking each other won't fix what's broken. If we lose control now, we'll lose everything, our homes, our families, our trust. And then what will we have left?" His words reached them. A few people began calming down. Some picked up fallen crates and put them back in place. A child started crying near the corner, and the man walked down from the platform to comfort him. The crowd slowly began to scatter, but the tension didn't leave completely. Just then, a loud voice came from behind, one of the troublemakers who had been stirring things from the shadows. He accused the man of pretending to care, saying that his calm voice was nothing but a trick to make people follow him. The crowd froze again. The man didn't argue. He looked directly at him and said softly, "I don't want anyone to follow me. I want them to follow what's right." The words hit hard. The troublemaker didn't reply, just turned away angrily and disappeared into the dark. The crowd slowly dispersed, tired and quiet. The market was filled with smoke, but the danger had passed, and for now, the man stayed behind, helping others fix what was damaged. He tied ropes, lifted heavy boards, and made sure no one was hurt. His hands were covered in soot, but he didn't care. He felt a strange calm inside him, like something was finally beginning to turn. As the night grew deeper, the sound of distant sirens faded. The officers who arrived were surprised to find that the chaos had already been handled, not by force but by the people themselves. One officer looked at the man and nodded quietly, almost in respect. When dawn finally came, the town looked exhausted. The air smelled of smoke and dust, but the light breaking through the clouds brought a small sense of relief. The man walked through the quiet market, watching people clean up and rebuild their stalls. Despite the mess, there was something new in the air: pride. They had faced the storm and refused to break apart this time. Later that morning, the mayor visited the market. He had heard about what happened during the night and wanted to see the damage himself. People gathered around him, talking all at once, explaining how the man had stepped in and calmed everyone down. The mayor listened, then turned to the man. "You did what none of us could," he said. "You brought them together." The man shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "They brought themselves together. I just reminded them they could." The mayor smiled and said, "Still, you've done something remarkable." He offered to recognize him officially, maybe even give him a position to oversee the market's peacekeeping. But the man refused politely. He didn't want titles or power. He only wanted the town to remember what it had learned. Over the next few days, the market became a symbol for the whole town. People from nearby areas came to see how order had been restored without violence. They were amazed by how united everyone had become. The same people who once shouted at each other now shared meals and helped one another repair broken stalls. The man watched all this quietly from his shop. He felt proud not of himself but of what the people had done. The flag near the entrance was cleaner now, freshly washed and fluttering brightly. Every time he saw it, he thought about how fragile peace was, and how beautiful it could be when people fought to keep it alive. One evening, as he closed his shop, a group of young men approached him. They were the same ones who had once mocked him, but this time their faces were different. They thanked him for what he had done and admitted that they hadn't understood before. The man smiled, shook their hands, and said, "It's never too late to understand." As he walked home that night, he noticed something he hadn't seen in months: laughter echoing down the streets. Children played, vendors joked, and music drifted from the nearby cafe. Life had returned to the town, gentle but strong. He stopped near the fountain where the fight had almost destroyed everything, and sat down for a while. The water sparkled under the streetlights, and the reflection of the flag danced on its surface. He took a deep breath, feeling peace settle inside him. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. He knew there would always be challenges ahead: disagreements, mistakes, even moments of anger. But he also knew the people now had something they hadn't before: belief. They believed that calm was stronger than chaos, that unity was more powerful than fear. As the night grew darker and the streets emptied, the man stood up and started walking home. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter behind him. He didn't turn back. He didn't need to, because in his heart he already knew, and the hardest part was over. Order had not just been restored in the market. It had been restored in people's hearts. The morning light touched the rooftops of the town, soft and golden, as if the sky itself wanted to breathe after a long night of tension. The streets that had been filled with shouting, fear, and broken things now lay quiet. There was smoke still hanging in the air, but it wasn't from fire anymore, just from the remains of what had burned out. People were stepping out of their homes, looking around with faces that carried both exhaustion and wonder. It was as if no one could quite believe what had happened the night before. At the corner of the street, the man who had stood in the middle of it all sat quietly outside his small repair shop. His clothes were dusty and his eyes looked tired, but there was a calm on his face that everyone noticed. He didn't speak much that morning. He just sat there watching people clean up, watching children run cautiously, watching the town come back to life in its own slow way. The shopkeepers who once fought over prices now stood side by side, sweeping the ashes from the ground. One of them paused, looked across the street at the man, and gave a small nod. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a thank you. Others followed one by one, each showing quiet respect in their own way. The man didn't wave or smile big. He just nodded back, keeping his hands busy fixing an old chair that someone had brought in. He preferred to go back to what he always did, fixing broken things. As the day went on, people began talking about what had happened. They said it was the first time in months that no one shouted, no one blamed, and no one tried to take advantage of others. It was strange but peaceful. The police officers who had once been on edge now stood more relaxed, helping without shouting orders. Even the market where it all began started to fill again, not with anger, but with quiet conversations, small laughs, and the smell of food being cooked. In the middle of the market, an old woman told a group of children about the man who had walked into the crowd the night before. She said he had no weapon, no protection, only his voice and his courage. The children listened closely, their eyes wide as if they were hearing about a hero from a storybook. But the truth was, he wasn't a hero in his own eyes. He was just someone who couldn't watch his town destroy itself anymore. Later that afternoon, a few people came to his shop to thank him personally. One man brought him tea, another brought bread. They stood around awkwardly, not knowing what to say. Finally, one of them spoke up. "You saved us," he said softly. "We didn't know what we were doing. You made us remember." The man smiled gently and replied, "I didn't save anyone. You all did. You just needed to listen again." Those words stayed with the people. In the days that followed, the town began to rebuild. Broken windows were fixed, burnt signs were replaced, and the walls that had been covered in angry words were painted over with bright colors. But more important than all that, people started helping each other again. When someone struggled, others reached out. When disagreements happened, people talked instead of shouting. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. One morning, a group of local officials visited the market. The mayor, who had been silent during the worst of the chaos, stood before the crowd and spoke with a humble tone. He admitted mistakes, promised fairer rules, and thanked everyone for standing together. Before leaving, he pointed toward the small shop at the corner and said, "That man reminded us who we are. He reminded us of what community really means. The day order was restored wasn't because of power or control, it was because of understanding." The crowd clapped, and though the man inside his shop heard it, he didn't come out. He didn't need to. He didn't want attention. He just wanted peace to stay. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to something close to normal, but it wasn't quite the same. It was better. The people had learned something through all of it. That peace wasn't given by anyone. It had to be made, protected, and cared for. They began holding small community meetings every week where anyone could speak. There were disagreements, of course, but they were handled with respect. The same man often sat in the back listening quietly, only speaking when necessary. His words were never fancy, but they carried weight because they came from the heart. One evening, a young boy came into his shop with a broken bicycle. As the man fixed it, the boy asked, "Why did you go out there that night? Weren't you scared?" The man paused, smiled slightly, and said, "Of course I was scared. Everyone was. But sometimes if no one steps forward, fear takes control of everything. I didn't want fear to win." The boy nodded thoughtfully, watching his bicycle come back to life, the same way the town had. When the sun went down that day, the market lights came on again. People laughed, music played softly from a small radio, and children chased each other across the street. It was a scene no one had seen in months. The man stood at the door of his shop, looking at the smiling faces, the soft glow of lanterns, and the peace that had returned. It wasn't perfect peace, and it never is, but it was enough. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the moment, and whispered to himself, "This is how it should be." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Seasons changed, but the memory of that night remained. People still spoke about it, not as a story of violence, but as a story of awakening. They said it was the night everyone remembered they were stronger together than apart. They called it, "The Day Order Was Restored." And though the man never claimed any title or recognition, his story spread quietly, through words, through gratitude, through the peaceful air that now surrounded the town. Years later, new families moved in, new shops opened, and new voices filled the marketplace. But the old ones still remembered. Every year, on the same night the fires had once burned, the townspeople would gather in the square, light candles, and share food. They didn't call it an anniversary. They called it a reminder of what it cost to lose peace, and how simple words and courage could bring it back. And the man who had once stood in the middle of chaos would sit among them, older now, quieter than before, but still with the same gentle look in his eyes. He never told anyone what drove him that night. Maybe it was hope, maybe love for the place he called home, or maybe it was just the belief that one person can still make a difference, even when everything seems lost. As the candles flickered in the cool evening breeze, he looked around at the faces, laughing, talking, living without fear, and felt a calm settle in his heart. The town was not perfect, but it was alive, and it was kind again. He leaned back, listening to the hum of life around him, and smiled. For him, that was enough. Order had not just been restored in the town, it had been restored in the hearts of the people who lived there. And that, he knew, was the greatest peace of all.